cold, dark, desolate.
Alone.
At 5 p.m. on the 27th of October 1915, the order was given to abandon ship. But for most of the crew, the decision had already been made. They knew that their ship, the Endurance, was beyond saving, and it was time to accept their fate. Ernest Shackleton gazed down at the icy expanse below, where he and his 27-man crew had been trapped since January of that year. Despite the piercing sub-zero winds of Antarctica, the sound of the wooden beams cracking under the relentless pressure of the ice was impossible to ignore. For nearly a year, these beams had so valiantly withstood the crushing weight of the ice, but now they could hold on no longer.
She's going, boys. I think it's time to get off.
From the moment Shackleton and his crew had become immobilized in the impenetrable ice 10 months earlier, they had been preparing for this moment. Although no one talked about it, the 27 men knew it was coming. Now, those on board removed their last remaining belongings from the ship and set up camp on the ice. Their mission was conclusively over, and now survival was the only thing worth pursuing. Little did anyone know, this was just the beginning of one of the most incredible stories of survival in history. The 4th of August, 1914, marked the day that Endurance departed Plymouth, England, headed towards Antarctica. Aboard the ship were 27 men, 69 dogs, and a stowaway who became the ship's steward. Expedition leader Shackleton, who had already failed twice to reach the South Pole, was determined to establish a base on Antarctica's Weddell Sea coast. His ultimate goal was to lead a small party, including himself, on the first ever crossing of the continent, arriving at the Ross Sea, south of New Zealand, where a group would be waiting for them with depots of food and fuel. As audacious as the mission had seemed, it very nearly was put to a stop before it even began. One month prior to the expedition's departure, a powder keg was ignited within Europe. The assassination of the Archduke of Austria had flung the continent into a frenzy of war. On the very day that Shackleton had a meeting with King George V, England declared war on Germany. Alone in his office, he waits, leaving the final decision on whether the expedition will go ahead or not to the hands of the British government. The hours ticked by anxiously, until a knock on the door. A one-word telegram read, "Proceed." And on they sailed. It was 4 months into the voyage when the indiscernible hunks of pack ice began to loom over the horizon. It was only a small patch of light stream ice at first, which the ship negotiated without difficulty. But 2 hours later, they came up against a band of heavy pack ice several feet thick and a half-mile wide. For more than 12 hours, they searched along the edge of it. At 9 o'clock the next morning, they found what appeared to be a safe passage and ventured through. It was their first major encounter with the Antarctic Weddell sea ice. Christmas 1914 came and went. First Officer Lionel Greenstreet remarked in his journal, "Here endeth another Christmas day. I wonder how and under what circumstances our next one will be spent." Barely able to hear one another over the sound of the howling wind, Shackleton races to the captain's bridge. It's the 15th of January, 1915, and despite the blue sky, the weather is slowly sealing the fate of those on board. Attempting to navigate the vessel is an unforgivingly pointless task, as it doesn't matter which direction the crew sail. Floes of ice as large as whole islands are engulfing around the Endurance, as if it were a game of Tetris.
Frozen, like an almond in the middle of a chocolate bar.
The next few months passed in a cycling blur of optimism followed by crushing disappointment. In order to escape the nightmarish monotony of the reality they found themselves in, hunting for seals and playing pranks on one another was the most common way to pass the time. Early in May, the sun appeared over the horizon for the last time, then slowly dropped from sight, and the Antarctic night began. It was now November, 7 months after being trapped within the frozen sea off of Antarctica, and 3 weeks after abandoning ship to set up camp on the formidable ice below. Puddles were forming, turning the surface of the floe that Shackleton and his crew so desperately clung onto into a swamp of melted snow and rotting ice. The summer temperatures saw it reach as high as 35 degrees Celsius during the day, adding to the already unimaginable discomfort the crew were enduring. Shackleton emerged from his tent. It was 4:50 p.m. Out of the corner of his eye, he noticed the ship move. He turned quickly and saw the ship disappear behind a mound of ice.
She's going, boys!
He shouted and dashed up the lookout tower. A moment later, all hands were out of the tents and scrambling to gain a vantage point. They watched in silence. And on the 21st of November 1915, the ship finally slipped beneath the ice to its icy, watery grave below. Trapped within the frozen expanse of the sea, the 28 men find themselves in a desperate situation. Their plan is to march nearly 200 miles westward across the icy terrain towards the nearest land. Whilst the men march, the currents of the ocean which lay beneath the ice would also be pulling them north at a rate of 2 miles a day, resulting in a northwesterly arch. But as they set out in the early hours of December 23, 1915, exhaustion begins to take its toll. After a mere 2 hours, they have covered only 900 meters, their bodies weary and spirits faltering. In the midst of their struggle, a voice cries out from the pack. It is the carpenter, Harry McNeish, who proclaims his refusal to continue. Yet, in truth, it hardly matters, for in the days to come, they will come to the grim realization that their grand march of 200 miles is an impossibility. Once again, they are forced to set up camp on the icy expanse, having covered a mere 7.5 miles in 7 days. A cruel twist of fate has left them in a worse position than before, having abandoned precious supplies and even one of their lifeboats. They wait, prisoners to the ice once more, with little to lift their spirits. The freezing temperatures cling stubbornly, keeping the surface of the ice in a perpetual state of wetness, like a desolate bog. Every step becomes a trudge through knee-deep slush, with the constant fear of plunging waist-deep into an unsuspected hole. There is little to be cheerful about, and with the rising tensions amongst some of the crew, their situation only grows more precarious with each passing day.
The monotony of life here is getting on our nerves. Nothing to do, nowhere to walk, no change in surroundings, food, or anything. God send us open water soon, or we shall go balmy.
It is late March 1916, and the dire food situation forces Shackleton to make a heart-wrenching decision. He calls out to his men, his voice heavy with sorrow, "We have to put down the dogs." Unable to sustain them any longer, plans are made for the following morning to end the lives of the remaining sled dogs. As dawn breaks on the 23rd of March, the men prepare for the difficult and unfortunate task of disposing of their loyal companions. A clearing broke in the thick fog which had made visibility near impossible for the past few weeks. Shackleton's eyes widen as he gazes towards the west. Through the swirling mist and clouds, the magnificent peaks of Joinville Island emerge, a tantalizing sight for the 28 stranded souls. Only 57 miles due west, it seems almost within their grasp. Unable to traverse the distance on foot, the crew places their faith in the powerful ocean currents, hoping they will carry them closer to land. Days pass before another break in the fog grants a chance to take location readings on the 8th of April. To the crew's disappointment, the currents have veered them 20 miles east, farther away from their salvation. At 7 p.m., the carpenter, McNeish, writes in his journal, "Our floe is broken up so small, it rises and falls with..." But before he can finish his sentence, chaos erupts. Amidst the disarray, Shackleton issues the order to launch the lifeboats. Their tiny island of ice, their fragile refuge for 4 long months, crumbles beneath their feet. Miraculously, all the men scramble into the 2 lifeboats, clinging to hope as they embark on their voyage towards land. In the midst of ceaseless snowfall and engulfing fog, the 28 men cling desperately. Divided among 3 lifeboats, they venture into the vast expanse of the unknown once again. It has been a staggering 450 days since they first became ensnared by the merciless grip of the ice. Now, over a year later, they find themselves back on the treacherous waters. Ironically, this was the long-awaited moment they had fervently dreamed of since their entrapment. But the stark reality proved to be vastly different from their hopeful visions. As soon as the boats emerged from the protective barrier of the pack, they were struck by the full force of the wind. The days blended together in an indistinguishable blur of fatigue and perseverance. Through it all, Captain Worsley navigated through the spray and the squalls until after 6 days at sea, Clarence and Elephant Islands appeared just 30 miles ahead. Worsley had by that stage not slept for 80 hours. In fact, sleep had eluded most of the men, for the simple fact that it was near impossible. When faced with the relentless onslaught of biting ice winds and bone-chilling temperatures, if a crew member was not navigating the treacherous waters, they were likely curled up in a fetal position, clinging to a sliver of warmth, counting the agonizing seconds until the day they could once again escape the confines of the boats.
But that day did come.
And as dawn broke on the 15th of April, the strain of the long, dark hours showed on every face. Cheeks were drained, and eyes were bloodshot from the salt spray. Shackleton searched their faces for an answer to the question that troubled him most. How much more could they take? It was the first time they had been on dry land since leaving South Georgia, 497 days previously. The likelihood of encountering any other living soul was incredibly small, and it became immediately apparent that the small beach they found themselves on would soon be swallowed in by the tide. Barely able to rest for a few hours, the crew were once again back in the lifeboats in the search for a more suitable camp. The next day, they were on land again once more. It was while sitting around the fire on the night of April 20th, 1916, that Shackleton addressed the weary men. Over the sounds of the wailing winds and waves crashing on the beach, he finally made official what everyone had expected for a long time. He would take a party of 5 men and set sail in the strongest of the lifeboats for the nearest inhabited land, South Georgia, 1,300 kilometers away. The sun rose over their rocky beach camp at 6 a.m. on the 24th of April. The weather was calm, and the wind was mild. After putting the finishing touches on the lifeboat, it took only a few minutes for Shackleton and his 5-man crew to disappear beyond the horizon. The success of the whole 800-mile journey depended on the pinpoint accuracy of Worsley's navigation, using observations that would have to be made in the most unfavorable of conditions. For 16 grueling days, they confronted monstrous swells that threatened to engulf their fragile boat, battling against ferocious winds and waves. Water was incessantly bailed out, and the sails were relentlessly beaten to free them from the icy shackles that clung stubbornly. 16 agonizing days spent navigating the treacherous open ocean, where time seemed to blur into a relentless struggle for survival. Just as the shoreline loomed into view, an unforeseen twist of fate seized them. "We're off course." Despite Worsley's best efforts, the relentless torrents of wind during their voyage had veered their vessel astray. Instead of landing upon the familiar populated north coast of the island, they found themselves marooned in unfamiliar territory, an east-facing inlet. It seemed reasonable enough to get back in the boat and sail around to the other coast. However, it wasn't to be the case. After all it had been through, the boat was no longer seaworthy and would have been a certain suicide mission to take it back out into the open waters. The five-man crew split into two, with Vincent and McNeish in no state to continue any further. Shackleton, Worsley, and Tom Crean set off to reach the populated whaling stations on the north coast by foot, climbing over mountains and sliding down glaciers, forging a path that no human being had ever forged before, until, after 36 hours of desperate hiking, they staggered into the station at Stromness. There was no conceivable circumstance under which three strangers could possibly appear from nowhere at the whaling station, and certainly not from the direction of the mountains. And yet here they were, their hair and beards stringy and matted, their faces blackened with soot from blubber stoves and creased from nearly 2 years of stress and privation. On the 21st of May 1916, all 5 members of the Sea Voyage party had been rescued. It would take another 3 months to rescue the 22 men left back on Elephant Island. The crew arrived back in England on the 29th of May 1917, over 3 years after leaving the docks of Plymouth. In the annals of human history, few tales rival the absurdity and triumph of Shackleton's survival. From the icy grip of the Antarctic wasteland to the treacherous open seas, their story echoes through time, a resounding reminder that when faced with insurmountable odds, the human spirit has the capacity to transcend the boundaries of impossibility.